Stop! Don't eat that! I screamed, bursting into my daughter-in-law, Betty's kitchen, and knocking the spoon from Donald's hand. The metal clattered to the floor as my son stared at me like I'd completely lost my mind. "Mom, what's wrong with you?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and embarrassment. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold up the navy blue lunchbox. "Betty accidentally sent me your lunchbox today," I managed to get out, my voice cracking with terror and rage. "And what I found inside?" The kitchen went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Betty's face drained of all color, but within seconds she forced this concerned, almost patronizing smile across her lips. "Melissa, you seem confused. Maybe you should sit down. You're scaring us." But I wasn't backing down, not when my son's life was hanging in the balance. If you want to hear how this nightmare began, and how I uncovered the truth that saved my son's life, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story gets so much darker than you could ever imagine. But I have to ask you, have you ever had that gut feeling that something was terribly wrong with someone close to you, even when everyone else thought they were perfect? Let me know in the comments, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about trust and family. Let me back up and tell you how we got to that terrifying moment in Betty's kitchen. I'm Melissa Hartwell, and I built Hartwell Perfumes from absolutely nothing into a multi-million-dollar company over 25 years. It was my life's work, my legacy. My son Donald is my only child and the absolute love of my life. When he married Betty 3 years ago, I honestly thought I'd finally gained the daughter I never had. Betty seemed absolutely perfect in every way. She was beautiful, charming, and always so genuinely concerned about everyone's well-being. She worked as a pharmaceutical technician, which made her seem even more caring and knowledgeable about health matters. I respected her profession and trusted her medical knowledge completely. When Donald started getting sick 6 months ago, Betty was actually the first person to insist he see doctors. She drove him to every single appointment, asked all the right questions that I wouldn't have even thought of, and even spent hours researching his symptoms online. I watched her dedication and felt so grateful that my son had found someone who cared about him so deeply. The symptoms came on so gradually that none of us really noticed at first. Donald started complaining about being tired all the time, which we all brushed off as work stress. Then came the stomach pain and nausea that seemed to come and go without any pattern. The weight loss was what really started to worry me. Donald had always been lean, but he was dropping pounds rapidly. His thick brown hair, which he'd always been so proud of, started thinning noticeably. We took him to doctor after doctor, but they were all completely baffled. Blood tests showed nothing definitive, just some elevated liver enzymes that could mean anything or nothing at all. The specialists ran every test imaginable, but Donald's condition remained a complete mystery. Betty was so devoted during this entire time. She made special meals for Donald, carefully researching which foods might help with his symptoms. She looked into supplements that could boost his energy and spent her own money on vitamins and herbs. She even took time off work to care for him when he had particularly bad days. I remember thinking over and over again how incredibly lucky Donald was to have found such a loving, selfless wife. I was so grateful she was taking such good care of him, especially when I couldn't always be there because of my business responsibilities. Looking back now, I can't believe how blind I was to what was really happening right in front of my eyes. But as weeks turned into months, Donald only got worse and worse. He lost 25 pounds from his already lean frame, and I watched my strong, healthy son literally waste away before my eyes. His skin took on this terrible grayish pallor that made him look almost corpse-like. Then he started developing these strange rashes on his hands that would appear and disappear without any explanation. The physical changes were devastating, but what really terrified me was watching my son disappear mentally. This was a man who used to jog 5 miles every single morning without breaking a sweat. and now he could barely make it up the stairs to his bedroom without gasping for breath. What really broke my heart was how his personality started changing completely. Donald had always been incredibly sharp and quick-witted, the kind of person who could solve complex business problems in minutes. He was brilliant with numbers and could remember the smallest details about everything. But suddenly, he began having trouble concentrating on the simplest tasks. He forgot conversations we had just hours before, looking at me with this confused, almost lost expression. During our weekly family dinners, which had always been filled with laughter and Donald's quick jokes, he'd zone out mid-sentence. He just stopped talking and stared blankly into space, like his mind had completely shut down. It was like watching someone I loved slip away piece by piece. Betty had an explanation for everything, and she delivered it all so convincingly. She told me that chronic illness often caused cognitive issues, that the stress of not knowing what was wrong was probably making everything worse. She suggested that maybe we should limit how often I visited Donald, saying that reducing his stress levels might help him heal faster. She even implied that my constant questions about his health were making him more anxious and potentially slowing his recovery. I trusted her completely because she was a medical professional, and I was just a worried mother who didn't understand these things. Looking back now, I can see exactly how cleverly she was isolating him from me. She convinced Donald to work from home more often, telling him the daily commute was too exhausting for someone in his condition. She took over all his medical appointments, claiming she understood the medical terminology better than he did and could ask the right questions. She positioned herself as his protector and advocate, making me feel like I was just getting in the way. Gradually, step by step, I had less and less direct contact with my son. And the sickest part is that I actually felt grateful to her for taking such good care of him. Yesterday morning changed absolutely everything, and it all started with one simple mistake that I now know saved my son's life. I was having my usual morning coffee when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Jake, the teenage son of our neighbor Mrs. Peterson. He was holding a familiar navy blue lunchbox and shifting nervously from foot to foot, looking completely confused and embarrassed. "Hi, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Betty asked me to drop this off at 47 Oak Street, but I think I might have gotten the addresses mixed up. Isn't that your son Donald's lunchbox?" I looked at the container and recognized it immediately. It was definitely Donald's work lunchbox, the same navy blue one he'd been using for years. Betty and Donald lived at 74 Oak Street, so Jake simply reversed the numbers. "Yes, that's Donald's," I confirmed, taking the lunchbox from his hands. "Betty probably asked you to take it to their house, not mine." Jake's face turned bright red with embarrassment. "Oh man, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. I had to drop off something for my mom at the Nolan house on Oak Street, and Betty asked if I could take Donald's lunch to him since he forgot it this morning. She specifically said 47 Oak Street, but now I'm realizing she probably said 74. I'm absolutely terrible with numbers. My mom's always getting on me about it." I smiled at the poor kid, trying to make him feel better. "Don't worry about it, honey. These things happen. I'll make sure Donald gets it." Jake hurried away, still apologizing over his shoulder as he practically jogged down my front walkway. I set the container on my kitchen counter next to my coffee maker and went about my morning routine. I had several business calls to make and emails to respond to, so the lunchbox just sat there for hours while I worked. It wasn't until much later in the day that curiosity finally got the better of me. I found myself staring at that navy blue container, wondering what Betty had packed for Donald's lunch. I'd always been interested in nutrition, especially since Donald had gotten sick, and I thought maybe I could get some ideas for healthy meals that might help him feel better. So I opened it up, thinking I just took a quick peek to see what kind of caring, nutritious meal Betty had prepared for my ailing son. You have no idea how dark this gets. Make sure you subscribe because what I found in that lunchbox will shock you to your core. Have you ever had a moment where one small mistake or coincidence completely changed your life? Because what happened next turned my entire world upside down and revealed a truth so horrifying, I still have nightmares about it. Inside the lunchbox was what looked like a perfectly normal lunch: a sandwich, an apple, and a small thermos of what appeared to be homemade soup. But something caught my eye immediately, something that made my stomach drop without me even understanding why. There were tiny white crystals stuck to the rim of the thermos, catching the afternoon light coming through my kitchen window in the most peculiar way. At first glance, they looked like ordinary sugar granules, maybe from sweetening the soup, but they had this strange, almost metallic sheen that didn't seem right at all. Something about them just looked wrong. My neighbor's son Lawrence happened to be visiting that day. He's a doctor who lives across the street and sometimes stops by to check on me. When I mentioned these odd crystals to him, he asked if he could take a look. I watched him examine the thermos more closely, his expression growing increasingly serious. Lawrence carefully scraped some of the crystals onto a piece of paper using the tip of a knife from my kitchen drawer. He held the paper up to the light, studying the crystals intently for what felt like an eternity. Then he looked up at me with an expression I'll never forget as long as I live. It was part shock, part absolute horror, and part urgent concern. "Melissa," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think this might be arsenic." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "What did you just say?" "I've seen it before in medical school," he continued, his voice growing more serious. "We studied cases of accidental poisoning, and these crystals have that same distinctive metallic appearance and granular texture that arsenic has. This isn't sugar, Melissa." My hands started shaking so violently I could barely speak. "But this is Donald's lunchbox. Betty packs his lunch every single morning." Lawrence didn't waste another second. He immediately pulled out his phone and called a colleague at the hospital lab, explaining that we needed emergency testing of an unknown white substance. He made it sound like a life-or-death situation, which I was beginning to realize it actually was. Within 2 hours, we had our answer, and it was worse than my worst nightmare. The lab results came back positive for arsenic trioxide, pharmaceutical grade. This wasn't the kind of arsenic you'd find in old rat poison or pesticides. This was the pure, medical-grade form used in certain treatments, the kind that someone with access to a pharmacy might be able to obtain. That's when everything clicked into place with absolutely sickening clarity. Donald's symptoms over the past 6 months, the crushing fatigue, constant nausea, dramatic weight loss, hair loss, cognitive issues, and elevated liver enzymes, were all classic, textbook signs of chronic arsenic poisoning. And Betty, with her pharmaceutical background and access to medical-grade substances, would know exactly how much to give him to cause a slow, seemingly natural decline without triggering immediate suspicion from doctors who weren't specifically looking for poison. My daughter-in-law had been systematically poisoning my son for months, and I had been thanking her for taking such good care of him. That evening, with Lawrence's help and the lab results in hand, I pulled out our family will and trust documents with trembling hands. I had to know what Betty stood to gain from Donald's death, and what I discovered made me physically sick to my stomach. According to our current estate plan, if Donald died before me, Betty would automatically inherit his portion of the company, 45% ownership worth approximately $12 million. $12 million that she would get simply by becoming a widow. But there was something even more horrifying. If both Donald and I died, Betty would inherit absolutely everything through Donald's will, since she was his legal spouse and we had no other close family members. The entire Hartwell perfume empire that I had spent 25 years building from nothing, worth over $30 million, would become hers completely. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those white crystals and imagined Betty carefully measuring them out, calculating exactly how much poison to give my son each day. I called my attorney at home that night, demanding an emergency meeting first thing in the morning. He confirmed what I'd feared in my worst nightmares. Betty stood to gain everything from Donald's death and even more from mine. This slow poisoning wasn't just attempted murder. It was a calculated, methodical business takeover, disguised as a loving wife, caring for her sick husband. She had been playing the role of the devoted caregiver while systematically destroying my son's health for money. The next morning, Lawrence and I went straight to the police station with all our evidence: the lab results, the lunchbox, photos of the crystals, and copies of the will documents. Detective Zoe Walsh listened to our entire story with a growing alarm written all over her face. She explained that arsenic poisoning cases were extremely rare, but when they did occur, they almost always involved family members with significant financial motives. The methodical, long-term nature of Donald's poisoning fit the pattern perfectly. She agreed to open an official investigation immediately. But then Detective Walsh explained the problem we were facing. We had evidence that Donald was being poisoned, and we had a clear motive for Betty. But we needed more concrete proof of her intentions and her actual involvement. More importantly, we needed to save Donald before the cumulative effects of months of arsenic poisoning caused permanent organ damage or killed him outright. The detective looked at me with complete seriousness and said something that chilled me to the bone. "Mrs. Hartwell, if we're right about this, your son might not survive much longer. We need to act fast, but we also need to be smart about how we handle this." That's when I realized we were running out of time, and Betty had no idea that her perfect plan was about to unravel. Detective Walsh proposed a plan that was incredibly risky, but absolutely necessary if we wanted to catch Betty and save my son's life. We would stage Donald's apparent death from his mysterious illness, then watch carefully to see how Betty reacted when she thought she was about to inherit everything. But first, we had to get Donald to safety and immediate medical treatment without alerting Betty to what we had discovered. I called Donald that morning, trying to keep my voice as normal as possible while my heart was pounding out of my chest. I told him I needed him to come to my house immediately for an urgent family matter, something that couldn't wait or be discussed over the phone. When he arrived at my door, I was shocked all over again by how frighteningly thin and weak he looked. This vibrant, strong man, who used to be full of life, was now a shadow of himself. Lawrence and I sat him down in my living room and showed him the lab results, the photos of the crystals, everything we had discovered. The look on Donald's face when he realized his wife had been systematically poisoning him for months was something I will never forget as long as I live. It was pure devastation, mixed with disbelief, betrayal, and this heartbreaking confusion. He kept saying, "But she loves me. She's been taking care of me," over and over again, like his mind couldn't process the truth. We didn't have time to let him process this emotional trauma. We rushed him to the hospital under a false name that Detective Walsh had arranged, where doctors immediately began chelation therapy to remove the accumulated arsenic from his system. The medical team said we had gotten him there just in time. A few more weeks of poisoning could have caused irreversible organ damage or death. Meanwhile, Detective Walsh's team was working around the clock, setting up surveillance equipment in Donald's house and around Betty's workplace. They placed hidden cameras in strategic locations and tapped her phone lines with a court order. The plan was deceptively simple but terrifying to execute. I would call Betty and deliver the devastating news that Donald had suddenly collapsed and died at the hospital. But then I would drop a bombshell that would make her panic if she was truly behind the poisoning. I would tell her that I was so devastated by losing Donald that I was planning to donate the entire company fortune to charity. If Betty was really behind this calculated murder plot, this news would make her absolutely panic. She'd lose everything she worked months to obtain through poisoning. The police hoped this would prompt her to do something desperate and incriminating that they could catch on camera. If you think this plan sounds crazy, just wait until you hear what happened next. Betty's reaction was more shocking than anyone could have predicted. Make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of this story will blow your mind. Have you ever had to make a decision where you knew there was no going back, where everything depended on getting it exactly right? Because what I was about to do would either save my son's life or put my own in serious danger. I made the hardest phone call of my entire life. With Detective Walsh listening on another line, recording everything, I dialed Betty's number with shaking fingers. When she answered, I took a deep breath and delivered the devastating news that Donald had died suddenly at the hospital. Her reaction was absolutely perfect. Too perfect, actually. She cried at exactly the right moments, with just the right amount of emotion. She said all the appropriate things a grieving widow should say. She even offered to help me with funeral arrangements, asking about flowers and burial preferences with what sounded like genuine concern. For a moment, I almost wondered if we had gotten this completely wrong. But then I remembered those white crystals and steeled myself for what came next. "Betty," I said, letting my voice crack with emotion, "I'm so destroyed by losing Donald that I can't bear to continue with the business anymore. I've made a decision. I'm going to dissolve Hartwell Perfumes and donate everything to the Children's Hospital where Donald was treated. I think that's what he would have wanted, to help other sick people." The silence on the other end of the phone was absolutely deafening. It stretched on for so long that I thought she might have hung up. When Betty finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the grieving widow I'd been talking to just seconds before. Instead, I heard panic, desperation, and something that sounded almost like barely controlled rage. "Melissa, you can't make decisions like that right now," she said, her voice tight and strained. "You're in shock. You're not thinking clearly. We should wait. Think about this more carefully. Donald wouldn't want you to just give everything away like that." I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice as she tried to backtrack and sound caring again, but it was too late. The mask had slipped, and I could hear the real Betty underneath. Over the next hour, Betty called me back 3 more times, and each call was more desperate than the last. She argued that Donald would want his wife to be taken care of financially. She said that donating everything was irresponsible, and not what family does. She kept pushing, trying to convince me to change my mind about giving away the fortune she thought she was about to inherit. Meanwhile, the hidden cameras that Detective Walsh had placed in Donald's house were capturing everything. They showed Betty pacing frantically around the living room, pulling at her hair, and making frantic phone calls to someone. The audio picked up fragments of her conversations, where she said things like, "The old woman's lost her mind," and "I've worked too hard for this to lose it all now." Each phone call she made to me revealed more of her true nature. The caring, devoted daughter-in-law was completely gone, replaced by someone who was panicking about losing $30 million. She wasn't grieving my son's death. She was furious about losing her payday. But what the cameras captured next would give us all the evidence we needed to put her away forever. The breakthrough that sealed Betty's fate came that very evening. Detective Walsh called me with barely controlled excitement in his voice. The surveillance team just watched Betty do something that gave us all the evidence we could ever need. They watched her enter Donald's kitchen and go straight to a small container that was hidden behind the flour canister. She pulled it out like she knew exactly where it was, like she'd done this countless times before. Then she began preparing what looked like another poisoned meal, even though she believed Donald was dead. The cameras captured absolutely everything in crystal clear detail. Betty carefully measured out those same white crystals I found in the lunchbox, mixing them into a fresh pot of soup, even talking to herself about dosages and timing like some kind of demented pharmacist. She was still planning to poison someone, and I had a horrible feeling I knew who her next target was going to be. But the most damning evidence came when Betty's phone rang. and she answered it, speaking freely because she thought she was completely safe in her own kitchen. What she said next made my blood run cold. "He's finally gone," she told whoever was on the other end of that call. "But now the old bat wants to give everything away to charity. I might have to speed up the timeline for her too. I've got enough arsenic left for at least 3 more doses." She was talking about killing me next. Her own mother-in-law, who had welcomed her into the family with open arms and trusted her completely. I wasn't just a witness to her crime. I was her next victim. That's when Detective Walsh's team moved in for the arrest. They burst through Donald's front door and found Betty still standing in the kitchen, still holding that container of arsenic-laced soup she'd been preparing for me. When confronted with all the evidence, the lab results, the phone recordings, the surveillance footage showing her measuring out poison, she finally broke down and confessed to everything. Betty admitted to gradually poisoning Donald over the past 6 months, carefully calculating doses to cause a slow decline that would look like natural illness to doctors. She planned to kill me next, once she'd inherited Donald's shares and could more easily access the company finances. Her pharmaceutical job had given her both the knowledge and the access to obtain pure medical-grade arsenic. The most chilling part was how methodical she'd been about it all. She had spreadsheets tracking Donald's symptoms, notes about dosages, even backup plans for different scenarios. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated business plan with murder as the strategy. Donald made a full recovery after 3 weeks of intensive chelation therapy. The doctor said that if we waited even another week, the damage to his organs might have been irreversible. Betty was sentenced to 30 years to life for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She'll be an old woman before she ever sees freedom again, if she lives that long. I've since established the Donald Hartwell Foundation to help victims of domestic violence and poisoning, because I learned that what happened to us occurs far more often than anyone wants to admit. Evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like the most caring, devoted person in your life. That accidentally delivered lunchbox saved my son's life. And it taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned. Evil can wear the most loving face, and the people we trust most are sometimes the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. If this story opened your eyes to how dangerous hidden evil can be, make sure you subscribe, because I share more true stories that will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Have you ever discovered that someone you completely trusted was living a double life? Share your story in the comments below, because you never know who might need to hear it.